I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
And we are two Shakespeare nerds who decided to make a podcast about our love for Shakespeare.
In this podcast, we will tackle as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which it was written, and how the text is viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as actors, how his plays can be responsibly performed today.
All while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry. So, Shakespeare, anyone? Hi, listeners. Elise here to remind you of all the ways you can support the podcast and the work that Courtney and I do. First up, we have a Patreon. Our Patreon patrons receive exclusive bonus content. Every month, we do a roundup of Shakespeare-related content we have found online. We also share Patreon-exclusive bonus episodes of the podcast. These look like extended versions of episodes you've heard here, collaborations with other Shakespeare podcasters, and Courtney and I doing reviews of Shakespeare-adjacent media, like TV shows, movies, and books that are inspired by or loosely based on Shakespeare and Shakespeare plays. Patreon patrons also receive snail mail from the podcast, and some levels even vote on future episodes of our podcast. If you are interested in checking out our Patreon, or just the Shakespeare-related names we've given the tiers of support, head to patreon.com/ShakespeareAnyone. The link is also in our episode description. After you've done that, please rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Your review might even make it on an episode. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and tell a friend. Word of mouth is our best form of advertising. Thank you so much for all of the support you give the podcast. Now, on to the episode. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Elise. How's it going?
It's going pretty well. How are you?
I'm also doing pretty well. We just wrapped up a very exciting conversation, and I'm excited for our listeners to hear this bonus episode.
Yes, because we are recording this after we just had the conversation. I don't know if people know that, but that's how we do things. Yeah, I'm really excited. This was a nice, I kind of think of them as like a palate cleanser in between our shows. So we just wrapped Romeo and Juliet, and we're about to head into our next show. And this is a nice little gelato course or whatever, shaved ice course in between two really rich meals.
Yes.
To just cleanse the palate.
Yeah, especially because we have a lot of guests on who are academics. And this time we have a guest on who is on the other side of Shakespeare. I mean, we think that the two worlds should be closer together, but we've brought on a theater maker.
Mm-hmm. Yes. We are joined today by Ricky Dukes, who is the artistic director of the Lazarus Theatre Company in Suffolk, England. Ricky founded the Lazarus Theatre Company in 2007 and has been artistic director since. He has directed over 30 productions for the company. In addition to his work with the company, he is also a freelance director and practitioner working across a range of drama training organizations, as well as offering text and audition technique workshops. The Lazarus Theatre Company is known for their radical and theatrical reimaginings of classical theater, including a lot of Shakespeare. Producing bold retellings that encourage new audiences to engage with the old plays with original scripts and exciting ensemble twists, Lazarus Theatre Company's latest venture sees an innovative prelude to the intense political climate soon to take place with 2024's election seasons around the world, with Julius Caesar, which is coming to Southwark Playhouse in September. We are going to talk to Ricky about his professional journey, as well as the work that Lazarus Theatre Company does, and how all of us around the world listening to Shakespeare Anyone can join Lazarus Theatre Company virtually for their production of Julius Caesar this fall.
Yes, and it's a wonderful conversation we had specifically about why Shakespeare, why this play, why now.
So please enjoy our conversation with Ricky Dukes. Hi, Ricky.
Hello, hello, hello.
Very nice to meet you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Ricky, we asked this of all of our guests. What was your first experience with Shakespeare?
Well, I guess a bit, actually, it's probably a lot of people's first experience. It was at school. And the way that we did it in the 90s in a secondary school, quite a rough secondary school in the Midlands, was you would just sort of handed the play text and you'd read a few lines and then you'd pass the book round. My school didn't have enough copies for everybody. So you had to sort of pass the book round, which of course makes absolutely no sense because you'd read 3 lines of Romeo, you pass it on, someone would read 3 more lines of Romeo, someone else would read, you go, who's Romeo? So it was a bit sort of odd, a bit boring. We didn't really see the point, quite frustratingly. And I suppose as most teachers at the time, and looking back at it now, I can totally see why they do it. They'd end up just putting on the video. So it was the video, the Baz Luhrmann VHS version of Romeo and Juliet, which I suppose most, well, maybe that's an assumption. A lot of people of my generation, that was the sort of first in with Shakespeare. But I really didn't like it. Whereas everyone else is like, oh my God, oh, he's so hot or she's so hot. I mean, that was basically the context of the conversation, not what was actually going on in the thing. And so it was a pretty removed, boring kind of experience, really. And as Shakespeare, because it's on the curriculum here, you have to do it. And so when you have to do something, when you're in a fairly rough council estate secondary school, you definitely don't want to do it. And then, so that's the negative bit out of the way. Everyone's going to be like listening to this going, wow, he's really had a bad day. The good thing that was turned around was I got to A levels. So there was a sixth form college at my secondary school. So I stayed on there and I got to A levels. And I don't kind of remember why I did English literature as an A level. I don't know why I did that. Maybe it's because I wanted to be a teacher. I don't know. Anyway, I ended up doing it. And there was a couple of cracking teachers who taught that course. And one of them took us to a production of The Merchant of Venice, which the Royal Shakespeare Company were doing. They were touring. And if I remember rightly, they were touring to sort of like unusual places. So if I remember rightly, it was in kind of like some leisure centre somewhere. So it was without all the sort of pomp and circumstance of theatre. And I actually grew up in a family that didn't really go to, I mean, we went to the pantomime, which is a bit of a British tradition, right? But we not from a theatrical background at all, nothing to do with really arts or culture, in fact, they're mainly into sport. Anyway, and we went to this production of Merchant of Venice, and years and years later, by the way, I met the director, who I told her that was my first thing. She went, oh God, it was dreadful. I was like, no, it was brilliant. Because I couldn't, I can't pretend to know what all the words meant, but there was something about the experience of it. And I'm using the word experience now because I fill in a lot of application forms, funding application forms, where you talk about experience. I didn't know what experience was then, like, how old was I? Sort of 17, sort of like, what is this? We dragged there on a coach. We desperately didn't want to go. And anyway, we went and watched it, and something about it just clicked. And I always remember on the coach on the way back to school that night, just saying to one of the teachers, talking about it. And he just turned to me and said, you got it, didn't you? And I said, yeah, I think I might have got it, I think. I wasn't quite sure what it was, but something just clicked and I understood it, whereas most of the people in the class didn't. So we went back and we had to, write essays, of course you do, because that's where it's assessed. But it was the first moment I went, oh, actually, I sort of think I might get this thing. And as all great teachers do, then just start to encourage whatever that it thing is. And years later, I went back to the school, actually, and I met him. He sadly passed away now. His name's John Hope. But I went back and I sort of recalled this story to him. And he said, well, sometimes that's what teaching's about. Just 1 in 30 gets it, but you do it for that 1 in 30. And so I sort of doffed my cap to that man because that was, or I blame him because it's his fault. So either way, he's sort of one of the many brilliant people I've met along my way that was the sort of signpost to the thing that I do now. So I hope I turn that negative story around into like a positive thing.
And I don't think it's an uncommon experience for that first, like I said, we ask this of all of our guests because everybody's first experience with Shakespeare isn't necessarily a positive one. It's sometimes very much like yours where it's in school and it's not inherently something that they're drawn to. And I think that's why we ask it, is because it's really interesting to hear how, just because you have this career that is so aligned with Shakespeare, it doesn't mean that it's always been that way. And it's really interesting to hear that it can be a journey for a lot of people who now work in Shakespeare or Shakespeare adjacent in their career.
And it sort of proves, I suppose, a point that you've sort of got to experience it as, well, I think, a performance. That's the only really way to experience it live and up on its feet. And that's something I take into the work all the way. And when I work with emerging artists or actors in training, that is pretty much 99% of the time the reaction is, you say, well, so what's your experience of Shakespeare? school, and they say this really downbeat kind of, and they don't really want to do the Shakespeare module at drama school. They're dragging, kicking and screaming into this thing. Why is he so great? And then you hope that by practicing it, playing it, getting on its feet and discovering it, people go, actually, this is pretty good stuff. And the thing that I always say to actors, even if you're not going to do Shakespeare, even if you don't want to do classical work, there's so much about learning how to do it that will unlock so many other, I mean, everything else. That's quite bold. But if you can dissect and analyze and perform a piece of Shakespeare, that commercial or advert piece of script is going to be well easy. You're going to nail that and walk into that audition room and just nail it if you can dissect a bit of Shakespeare. But yeah, and it has been a journey.
I want to move on to another piece of your journey. You founded the Lazarus Theatre Company in 2007 and serve as its artistic director. Can you share the mission of the Lazarus Theatre Company for our listeners?
Yeah, just give you a bit of context about what Lazarus is, I suppose. So I'd gone to university and I thought I was going to be a teacher. But before I went to university, a tutor at my A-level stage said, what are you going to go and do? And I said, I'm looking at teacher training courses. And they're like, do not do that. Do not do that. You are going to go into a classroom with a bunch of young people who don't want to be there. You will get to the age of 40. You'll look around the room and go, what have I done with my life? I think she was probably talking a bit more about her than, than what I should do. It sort of struck me, she would go and do something that you are passionate about and love about, and then you can do a one-year teacher training course. This, over here we call it PGCE, so a one-year training course after your degree, right? So I thought about it, so I did, and I went to university to drama and performance studies, but I went to the University of Worcester, which also makes you do a combined degree. And so it forces you to have to do at least a module in something else, which at the time I was about. And then actually you sort of go, this is brilliant because it opens your mind. So I did a module in business management, i.e. running a theatre company, which I never thought I was going to do. There was some media and marketing things. There's some education studies stuff. And so you come out a bit sort of more broad, I suppose, a bit more rounded. So I went and did that. And at that time, at university, I joined the Drama Society and I directed a few things there. And at the end of it, I was leaving the Drama Society. I thought, well, maybe we could set something else up and just do sort of classics, because that's sort of the stuff that gets me sort of really excited. And we were looking for a name for what we call it. It's not just the Classics Company. And there's a guy in the course called Jason Carnegie, so shout out to Jason, who said, oh, you know what you are, don't you? And I thought, oh, here we go. And he said, you're a right Lazarus. And I didn't know what that meant. So I just laughed and went, yeah, Jace, yeah. And walked away, sort of no idea what that is. And then I didn't think of it anymore. And then I went to drama school and I was working as an actor and I became quite disillusioned fairly quickly. I wasn't sort of doing the sort of work that I wanted to do. And so someone said, well, why don't you put your money where your mouth is and put on some work, the kind of work that you do want to do? So we did, and we put on a production of Medea. We started really cheerful. So we did Medea, of course, like go really hard on it. And we were struggling for a name for the theatre company. And it just came back to me, remembering Jason Carnegie down the corridor at the University of Worcester, turning around to me and going, you're a right Lazarus, you are. And I thought, what was he talking about? So I messaged him, I think it was via Facebook, and what did you mean, Jason? He said, well, you know Lazarus from the Bible. And not being I was going to say practicing Christian, I'm not a Christian at all. I sort of didn't quite know what that was. So anyway, looked it up. And of course, Lazarus is the character or person, depending on how you look at the Bible, right? That was brought back from the dead. And so he said, that's what you do with classics. You sort of bring them back from the dead. And so when they're really obscure plays that no one knows about, you literally give them new life. And when they're plays that are performed quite a lot, like some of the big Shakespeares, you give them a new life because you look at them in a different way. And I thought, God, that's brilliant. Yeah, like, you're totally right. That is what we do. So that's where Lazarus was born, which was a long time ago. So I suppose what we're about really is we're looking at classic plays, and that's not just Shakespeare, that's his contemporaries. But what is a classic play? I think the definition is up till something like 1951. From the Greeks to 19. So I sort of think that's quite a broad spectrum. So when people say, oh, you're the Shakespeare guy, you do Shakespeare, like, it's quite a broad. But I suppose, yeah, fair enough. We do quite a lot of Shakespeare. We have an ensemble approach. So that's working collaboratively in a rehearsal room. All of our actors are in the room together all the time, all together, which is a sort of dying kind of process in the UK in theatre. Just not having enough rehearsal time, not having the money to have everyone there all the time. So it's sort of European in that approach. Our approach is quite dramaturgical led. So it's all about the text. That's our starting point. If we're stuck in the room, we go back to the text. Not in a kind of purist way where we sit around a table for weeks, but that's our source material. which is really interesting in our current project with Julius Caesar, because we've got actors saying, yeah, but the historical Caesar didn't do that. And you're like, well, we know Shakespeare's not a historian. He's not
Yeah.
doing a documentary piece of drama. He's not
Yes.
really interested in the truth, whatever the truth is, of the historical character. So that's it, really, I suppose, is that's our mission. It's really important to us, though, that when we look at doing these plays, we have to ask ourselves, why this play again? And I suppose for us, it's looking at it from a different prism, whether that's casting, whether that's setting, we're putting it in some sort of scenario, or whether it's just being kind of, and this is where Caesar's falling into line, he's just being aware of what's going on in the world at the moment. Does that answer that question? I realised I went on a yellow brick path around.
That answered it wonderfully. And I think it really also leads into my next question, which is, your company is known for these radical and theatrical reimaginings of the texts, and you've given us a little sneak preview of some things there. But why do you feel it's important for modern audiences to engage with these classical texts?
I think it's something about them. I guess what he does is he and his contemporaries, he being Shakespeare, by the way, are interested in people and humanity. But also, the thing I absolutely love about it is in the context of the world events, the societal stuff. And I find quite a lot with new writing, and this is going to sound scandalous now, but I think sometimes with some new writing, it's so individual-led and issue-based, it starts to become a bit reductive. But before anyone gets on the phone to complain about what I've just said about new writing, there are some writers that don't do that. But actually getting a play produced with a big company that has big societal conversation is very difficult, near to impossible, particularly in the UK at the moment. But actually, I'm sort of challenging myself on that. I am at the moment working with a writer on a new play that is being written in the style of a large ensemble for specific actors. So it's sort of in a kind of Shakespearean company kind of way. But I think what he does is he speaks to us as humans and our place in the world, which I find, because I'm quite into my Brechtian practice, I find there's something that feels charged and energetic about that. That theatre, they're not just only a form of entertainment, it is an agent for change or stimulus for change. And I'm not romantic enough to think, a little play I'm doing in Southwark makes everyone go, oh, I can see the world a different way. But you never know, that kid who's being dragged there on a school trip might sit there and really not want to go. And they might be on a coach trip back to their school. And they say to their teacher, wow, that's just made me change the way I think about something. Mm-hmm. And that might only be 1 in 30, but that's me sort of putting back in the pot, I guess. And then he asks us, again, maybe controversially, I think he does it better than most early modern writers. He then gives us the predicament. And he says to the audience, what do you think about it? And what are you going to do about it? For me, anyway, it doesn't feel like he gives us answers in a very neat form. I know the comedies, we get the last scene where everything's wrapped up, right? Mm-hmm. But that sort of feels like we've got to wrap it up quick because we're at the end of the play. Mm. But it doesn't mean we've not gone through some impossible predicaments. And by predicament, I mean sort of challenge, obstacle, impossible dilemma. Yeah. That we, hopefully as an audience, in a kind of sort of Brechtian way, we sit there and go, but what would I do in that scenario? Just literally us thinking, what's our role in this? What does this say about the world we're living in? And I think he speaks quite directly to that and has a relevance possibly always, which might be a bit bold, but.
Yeah, I think that's interesting too, because I think about how there are so many contradictions in Shakespeare's plays where one character, like Caliban versus Prospero, and Shakespeare genuinely writes these contradicting perspectives. So even though there is a conclusion, that doesn't mean that that's what people take away from the play.
Yeah, totally. And something I say in rehearsal all the time, I don't like the word character. Character sort of implies we're adding things on top. I love talking about the people in the play. And the people in the plays are just as complex as we are. There isn't a good person or an evil person. We're all people. Mm-hmm. And we're all doing things in certain scenarios because of the circumstances we're in. If you don't agree with that, then maybe the situation might be a good person has to do evil things in the circumstance. Evil people might do good because of the circumstance, or you see. So I guess, again, I suppose it's the Hamlet thing, isn't it? Holding a mirror up to nature. Mm-hmm. We're sat there going, yeah, I might not have literally been in Macbeth's situation where I'm about to assassinate the monarch just before, MI5 come careering into my house. I might not have been in that experience, but I do know what guilt feels like. I do know what betrayal feels like. I definitely know what jealousy feels like. And so I don't need to see my own life because, if they wrote a play called Ricky, it would definitely be a tragedy, but it would be pretty boring. It wouldn't be Macbeth. But I don't need a play about my life, but there are things, themes, feelings, circumstance, situations that are explored in these plays that just, I suppose, for an audience ignites us going, yeah, we can experience or we can relate or we can find something immediate in that circumstance. And I don't think it's important that we do it in a kind of worthy way, as in, oh, it's all good for you. And I do also acknowledge that not everybody likes going to Shakespeare plays. I've been to some where I've been really bored. I won't mention them now on the podcast, but we can talk about it afterwards if you like. Mm-hmm. But there's some very high-profile Shakespeare productions we've had in London recently that I found definitely boring. Mm-hmm. I'm not a complete convert, as in everything that comes out of every actor who speaks Macbeth, or any director either, because I sound like a director blaming the actors. Not everyone's directorial visions of these plays are great. I was listening to your Titus one the other day, talking about Julie Taymor was in Visit, and I thought, this is interesting because some people I know think that's the best version of Titus ever, and they love all the surrealism stuff. I was like, oh God, isn't this brilliant that he still causes this debate? Mm-hmm. Because he's given Julie the source material and she's done what she's done. Anyway, sorry.
No, don't worry about apologizing. One, thank you for listening. Two, yeah, it's incredible that his work is still so versatile because, as you mentioned, it's exploring humanity in an extreme. What does a person do when they're put to this extreme and they're still a person? They're still dealing with grief or guilt or Hamlet. What do you do if you suspect your stepfather of murdering your father? How do you figure that out? And how do you decide? People talk about, oh, Hamlet's all about inaction versus action. But what would you do if all of a sudden you were like, wouldn't you want to get more proof? Wouldn't you want to spend the entire time gathering proof until you were absolutely sure that that's what actually happened?
And that's not inactiveness, is it? That is the action he takes. He goes on a sort of quest to go, is this right? Is this absolutely right? I've got to get the evidence. It's not that he doesn't not do anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, a lot of the tragedies in that way are almost like thrillers. Like the modern genre would be like a psychological thriller of watching somebody either unravel or trying to piece together something before they themselves are in danger in a like hyper surveillance state. Because one, Elizabethan England was, and two, Shakespeare put these characters that he was writing into these very heightened places that we can still find commonalities. One thing that we say over and over again is like, not much has changed in the 400 to 500 years since these plays were written.
But I guess that's his sort of, I'm sort of careful about using the word genius. Because the reason I'm sort of cautious about the word genius is it sort of puts him on a pedestal that we then feels we can't reach. And one thing I try and do in a rehearsal room is take him off it straight away and just start wrestling him on the ground. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
and start getting muddy with him. Yeah,
we
get
definitely do.
With him. Get restless with him. Get annoyed, frustrated. What is he doing? My big thing in a rehearsal room is, what's the writer given us? What's the signposts in the play they're trying to get us to discover? And then when we discover them, we'll be informed by the source material. But there might be something else in there, like an archaeological dig, that we've never discovered before. Mm-hmm. And I probably should have said this earlier, actually. That's something else with our kind of mission and our approach is treat them like they're new plays. It's so difficult approaching some of the big plays to get rid of the baggage, to get rid of the BS that's been attached to them.
Yeah.
In my life, I think that's because of the BBC did that long series, television studio recording season of all the plays. And they're so starchy, they're so still and wooden and a bit boring. I mean, I'm glad they did them because they're kind of an archive of time. But I wonder whether we'll look back at some of the RSC's DVDs in 20, 30 years' time and go, OMG, that's so boring. I wonder whether some people feel that Hamlet's inactive because quite a lot of famous actors play him internally. And something I try and get, and it's a key thing on my list of things to look out for, is who shares the story. Who keeps it to themselves and tells us about it, or tells themselves about it, or who shares the dilemma, who shares the predicament. And I think sometimes you have to remind everybody that there's no fourth wall and it's not naturalism. We're here to share the story. if Hamlet's telling himself about his predicament, his problems, you're like, well, what's my role in this? Why am I here? Why have I paid this money and spent my time in the room with you? Whereas if Hamlet turns to the audience and says, my dad is dead, I've come back from university. In that space of time, my mum has remarried. The man she's married is my uncle, who has now taken my dad's job, place, literally bed. Oh, and by the way, my dead dad came back to me and told me my uncle did it. And all of a sudden, the audience just goes, oh, holy crap. Oh, how are you going to resolve this? And we did a production of it in early 2023, and I did depending on which reviews you read, it was great or awful. But we did it where I cut all the adult characters. So it was just the young people. Mm. And sort of just trying to get into some idea of what these young people, we set it in this kind of youth club meets young person's detention centre, meets sort of council estate kind of space where they gather, therapy. So the piece started off where all the company came in, sat in a circle. They told each other their actor's name and who they're playing. So almost like a sort of drama therapy thing. And then the play began. And it was interesting, Michael Hawkey, who played Hamlet, even though we'd sort of tried to bust some myths about this rhetorical talking to himself, there's something still inbuilt about Hamlet. I find this quite a lot with a lot of female roles as well. Even when I work with quite feminist performers, who we talk about why it needs to crack this victim-y, kind of wallflowery, soft-voiced, polite young lady. Actually, they still fall into those traps. And I think some of that is in the writing, but I think majority of it is the baggage that we've had. There's no way, I mean, I can't believe how many Lady Macbeths I've seen who is softly spoken and quiet in the corner. And you're like, have you read this, guy? It's like, this woman's incredible. Juliet's a perfect example for me as well. Like, she's sneaking boys into a bedroom against her dad's permission. Like, this girl is not a nice little girl. This girl knows what she wants, and she wants to gallop a pace, with his fiery-footed steed, right? Like, good on her. She's in this world of discovery, right? And we treat them as these polite little sort of garden party plays, which I find really dull.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought up the baggage, because one thing that I think in our work we try to do is take away that pedestal, take away that baggage, because so much of that baggage is, as you've mentioned, brought on by the hundreds of years in between the time that Shakespeare was writing these plays for a company of actors that he worked regularly with, who probably would have quit had he not given them good roles, things that they wanted to do. There were other theaters, they would have gone and worked somewhere else. And the hundreds of years of misogyny and white supremacy that have then been added on top of these plays.
The Victorian era.
We have a real beef with Victorians now, more so than before, because we keep coming back to, wow, this is a time where all of a sudden they started producing these plays in a completely different way. And a lot of our assumptions are still very ingrained in what the Victorians thought Shakespeare and what the Victorians used Shakespeare to do to further their agendas. As an artist, years before starting this podcast, and as somebody who is often cast in those feminine roles in Shakespeare, I had that epiphany of like, why is Ophelia always this weak-willed person? And how can I make her strong? Because there's no way that he wrote these lines intending for her to not be telling off Claudius and Gertrude for their part in what they've done to Hamlet. And these women have so much agency. And so what culturally are we doing when we, as artists or as people engaging with these plays, remove that agency from them and present them as these wallflowers? Or like you said, Juliet, she's also the one who says, we need to get married before we do anything. I want to do something, but you got to put a ring on it first.
Cue dance break.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And I think there's, again, the experience of Hamlet recently. The one thing about removing the adult characters, which, some people thought was sacrilege, but I thought we've seen a lot of Hamlets. Like, you don't need the whole thing again. We've seen it. One thing I hadn't really expected, but was kind of as an experiment, kind of relevated really, was the situations that the young people are put in are all engineered and designed by the elders. So, just talking about the nunnery scene, as it's famously known, but Ophelia walking in that room, she's sort of set up by the dad.
Yeah.
I mean, what sort of father does that to their daughter in a room where he thinks that man is mad? if that happened now, I'd like to think some sort of social services would be called. A father's like bait. He's using it as bait.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I'm going to be just watching, but I'm not going to interfere.
Yeah. I mean, what on earth? I mean, I'm not a parent, but I'd like to think I would never put a child of mine. I'm a human. I'd like to think I'd never put anyone else in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
And you absolutely agree with you that she fights back. She fights back to this guy. You know, I'm trying to think of that line, you know, where he's testing her honesty. And she says, what do you mean, my lord? What are you trying to say? If you're calling me a whore, say it. You say it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether she suspects he can't because he knows something else going on. But at the same time, she calls him. She calls him. It's really interesting. It's awful. It's painful when you talk about we're not going to play it in that same way. And yet night after night, it still falls into tropes. I'm also aware that different performers have their own agenda, how they want to play something, but also what they want to be as an actor perceived as. And that was a bit of an interesting wake-up call to me, because I think it's dangerous when you put your own agenda into what a character does, because the characters might not have the same, well, there's a very good chance they won't have the same agenda as you. But it's really disappointing. Ophelia, Desdemona fights for her life.
Mm-hmm.
So why do I keep seeing productions where she's sort of just whimpering in a corner? You're like, this girl's going for it. She's got to fight to get out of this room, you know. I suppose the victim element comes from they're inevitably going to get it.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't mean we have to play the inevitable all the way through. And in fact, with a tragedy, I would say not play the inevitable, play the opposite of the inevitable. There is a chance that that's not going to happen. It's also, on another level, it's just really boring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, don't play the ending. Otherwise, what are we doing here?
No. Why am I sitting here for 4.5 hours waiting for the old guy in King Lear to die? You know, I need to be at the end there thinking he's going to get to Cordelia in time. I need to be there when they're going to be reunited and everything's going to be all right.
Mm-hmm.
Because when it doesn't all be all right again, it breaks my heart again. But if I already know 4 hours before, I think I might as well go to the bar because I already know.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And I say that even with a play like Romeo and Juliet that gives the spoilers in the first 5 seconds, like we already know how it's going to happen. But I suppose the tension, the drama there is, how is that going to happen? And something else I bring into the rehearsal room quite a lot is there's no such thing as fate, which is really difficult when you're doing a play like Romeo and Juliet and they talk about fate all the time.
Where they're like, it's fate, but
inside the play, it's fate, but we can't play it with inevitability because
right.
It will just become boring. Also, it disempowers the characters of choices. These people have choices in the circumstances they're in. And the more I find that performers play the choice points, the more it makes the audience go, well, I wouldn't have done that.
Mm-hmm.
And you go, great, I'm glad that you wouldn't have done that. You know, like Medea, if she kills the kids, spoiler alert, I would hope there would be people in the room going, well, I would never kill my children. Well, good. It's not a test, by the way, but it's just a little bit of a check in with us as a society. Because what if actually you were playing to an audience where someone would go, yeah, I'd have done it as well.
Mm.
That would be fascinating. I'd sort of weirdly love to be in an audience where, or a post-show Q&A or something, or in the bar afterwards, where a woman in the audience go, I totally understood where she's coming from, and I would have done that as well. And you go, whoa, let's unpack that. Where are you? Obviously you need to give support and stuff. But anyway, this is the bit that I find theatre really interesting, exciting, because it sort of sparks something in us by going through this safe experience. And I say safe because we all know it's a play, right? Of what these people go through. That's what the curtain call's for, isn't it? Just to tell us all everyone's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And thank us, but also just everyone's all right. And I do sometimes find that, particularly in productions of Titus and bloody and terrible plays, where you see the audience counting people in the curtain call. Oh yeah, they're all there. Yeah, that's all right. Everyone's fine. And you still think, well, of course it's a play. It just shows how much they care about the people they've just been invested in, that they have to check they're all okay.
I really loved how this kind of is tying together a few threads of approaching the 400-plus-year-old texts as if they are new works, as if we've never read them before, because there's always also the potential for someone in the audience to have no idea what Romeo and Juliet's about, even though it is so ingrained in our cultural capital and cultural context. There's always that chance. And what is their experience going to be like, and how are we making sure that this play, and I'm going to use this to segue into my next question for you, how do we make sure that they are brought along on this journey of these people and that they care and are invested? And to that point, part of the mission of your company is making classical live theater accessible. Can you share some of the different ways that you approach accessibility and how you break down barriers to live theater access?
Yeah, I think a great place to start is just assume that nobody knows it. So just assume that nobody knows it, because if then people are in the audience and they do know it, great, they've got a bit of a Brucey bonus. They sort of got a bit of context. But I don't want to isolate or exclude anybody. Oh, well, they'll all know this anyway. So, and then I think if you sit there and go, oh, well, they all know what happens to Hamlet anyway, what's the point in doing it then? They already know. So that's something I think is really important. And I set out with a creative team really early, is there's nothing obvious. There's, I think Brecht says something along the lines of the word obvious is only used by people who are too lazy to look again. And I sort of think in true Brecht sort of unrelenting style. And I sort of think actually it's quite useful, because if we go into a room or a creative process and nothing's obvious, we've got them in our mind of people who have not experienced it before. And that might be you not experienced the play, the story, the characters, but it almost just might be not been in a theatre before. And so one of the big things we do, we've got a great project we're trying to build in Southwark with Southwark schools to make sure that we're reaching young folks. Depending on the context of the play, it's sort of 14 to 16, because there's things happening in these plays, right? So we've got to be kind of conscious about when you introduce certain plays to certain age groups. But at the same time, people are seeing all sorts of things on the internet and TV. And it's almost a recognition of when you feel like you're getting old, when you think, oh, God, 14-year-olds, this might be a bit harrowing. And a 12-year-old says, mate, that's nothing. Like, oh, wow, when I was a child, this would have been horrific. But, 9-year-olds are like, yeah, kill him, But we had was it a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old come to see Hamlet? And they loved all the fighting, like, yeah, stab him, go on, stab him. And I thought, gosh, how very Elizabethan. Because I imagine that's how it was in the Globe, yeah, get him, bit him. And then I suppose what that leads you to is thinking about what does access really mean? It just means allowing or facilitating or opening the doors up to everybody and anybody. There is certain schemes. So we do access performances like captioning, audio described. This show, Julius Caesar, is going to have our first relaxed environment performances. But actually, even before we get there, we're thinking about actually shouldn't all performances be relaxed environment? What does relaxed environment versus relaxed performance means? What does that mean? If it literally means you can leave and come back when you want, well, yeah, it's not prison. Shouldn't all performances be like that? Question mark. I'm posing that question, by the way, because there are people on the team who don't think that's right. And no, because other people want to concentrate and want to focus and they don't want people up and out and around. So it's a conversation. The big thing at the moment with the cost of living crisis here in the UK is money. Is literally being able to afford to go. So what we've done on Julius Caesar is there's 1,000 tickets for Southwark residents, and Southwark in London is a big borough. It's sort of huge. When you sort of think of the Southwark demographics, you're like, actually, it's a massive, massive borough. For young people 16 to 25, there's education tickets, and then there's artist tickets. So anybody who works in the creative industry, and they're all a tenner, and there's 1,000 of those. They're nearly gone, actually. So we're sort of like, oh, gosh, do we need to add some more? Because this is brilliant. But, of course, at the same time, we've actually got to pay people. So it's a balancing act. So trying to break down the economic barriers. And then the other thing that we found during the pandemic, we saw lots of people making online theatre, Zoom theatre, and quite quickly we knew it wasn't for us, because it's the live in the space shared experience that we were missing. So we didn't really invest much in it, actually, and we were looking at other ways. So we used that time and period to think about where else as a company could develop. But the one big thing that came out of this was streaming. And I'd never really done much stream theatre before. And I found it a bit sort of, during the pandemic, the National Theatre was doing their NT Live once a week. And I got a bit nonchalant about it. Like, not realising this is an extraordinary thing. Like, stop being so passive about it. Like, thank goodness they did it. It was the same time every week where they would put it on YouTube and you could, watch it, which is fantastic. Thank goodness the last one did it. But that's something we've kept. So every production, we have a streamed performance, because we've met so many people around the world who can't get there physically. And we've also met people who, for physical reasons, can't get to the building, although the Southwark Playhouse is completely accessible. Just public transport in London can be difficult for people. And the whole experience of going to the theatre then becomes actually not just problematic, becomes an ordeal. And it should never be an ordeal, should it? Going to the theatre shouldn't be an ordeal. So we've kept the streaming element of it. So we record it as live, but for technical reasons, we don't live stream anymore, because we did do that with one show and it was let's say, interesting. There was more drama backstage than there was on the stage, which is never good. So what we do now is we record 2 performances as live, and then we've got this cracking team from a company called Theatrical Solutions. They edit to it, but it's warts and all. So they don't do anything glossy or whizzy or like the Tony Awards, sweeping crane stuff. They don't do any of that. It's sort of raw, live, in the moment. If the actor slips up on a line, that's in. We're not going to do retakes. So it's a bit rough around the edges, which I love because it contains that feel of liveness.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels to me then it's important because you're getting people to engage. There's no point doing like boutique theatre where it's the same crowd who come and see, oh, I saw the production in 1961. You're like, yeah, that's great, but this is one's now. This is 2023. Like, what about now? What's going on now? And I think I'm right in saying that one of Shakespeare's most used words is now. And so it feels to me like a writer that's occupied or preoccupied with the here and now. And that's really useful in a rehearsal room because I say to an actor, yeah, but what's happening in the moment, at the moment, on the moment? They don't know that yet because that's not been said. What do they know now? How are they responding now? And so, well, that's something we try and take into the company is how do we talk to communicate? I was about to say let people in, but it sounds like we're a gatekeeper. Let them in. It's not about letting people in. It's just making sure they can get in.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a number of those kind of initiatives. And it's something that we've built up in the 4 years we've been at Southwark Playhouse and continue to build. And going forward, we want to really start making integrative access provision inside the show. So there's a show that we've been working on for a while that hopefully we'll be doing next year, where the captioning is in the set design. It's not just a screen shoved at the side.
Mm-hmm.
Audio description, we're thinking about how can we rewrite. Actually, Shakespeare's brilliant for audio description because he literally describes, but who comes here? 'Tis the worthy Thane of Ross. I mean, that's literally the audio description. He's brilliant for it. So we're like, why is no one doing that? And we're like, maybe it's really terrible, but let's see. There's a big Brecht play we're hopefully doing that, again, the stage directions, the characters already audio described. So it's stuff that actually is already there. We don't really have to do a huge amount, that we could go, let's just keep trying to break down barriers to people experiencing this stuff.
That's fantastic. And I love the many modalities that you're thinking of access. And that's not, as you said, it's not a let more people in. It's no, how do we just not have barriers? How do we just make theater should be something that every human gets to experience? And how do we meet people where they're at and what they're able to do? Speaking very generally, so many theaters consider accessibility once somebody's in the door. But as you've spoken to, accessibility starts before somebody gets to that door. And there are often hurdles to opening that door and walking in. And it sounds like you are thinking of what are other ways to engage with people who physically can't get to that door for a myriad of reasons.
Absolutely. The journey begins way before they're there, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we had quite a big back and forward debate about the artwork for Julius Caesar because people haven't seen it. It's a figure of a man with blood on him. It's sort of raining blood, which is sort of a nod to something that might happen in the production. But it's people were saying, actually, that needs a bit of an audience guidance note on it, because if I'm just scrolling through Instagram or Twitter/X and a picture of a man covered in blood comes up, that could be for some people, whoa, what the hell's that? And so you go, oh yeah, I mean, God, you really do have to think about it. But also just to say, all this access, inverted commas stuff isn't a nice thing to do. It's not like, oh, look, aren't we good people? It's not a fast track to heaven because I'm already knowing I'm not going there. But anyway, it's just about exactly as you say, it's not letting people in. It's just making sure people can.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a nice thing to do. That's just like, should be standard, shouldn't it? But I suppose it tells us that in our industry, quite a lot of things do have those barriers. They may be barriers like the relaxed environment issue. It might be barriers because some people don't want people getting up and out and in and out and down the aisle and round and round. And sometimes I go to cinema in the UK, and depending on which chain you go to, some cinemas are like a riot. I mean, people are in and out and up and down, kids running down the aisle, and you're like, oh my God, this is horrendous. And then there's others that you go and everyone's going to be sort of sat down and, in inverted commas, well behaved. So I do understand that when some people push back, I don't want people going in and out. But funnily enough, I went to King Lear at the Almeida, their relaxed environment performance. And it was about 3 and a bit hours. It was blooming long. But actually, the relaxed environment to them just meant the house lights were slightly lifted, slightly. And other than that, nothing else had changed. And I would say, I don't know, about 4 or 5 people went to the loo and came back at an appropriate point. It didn't distract my experience. And actually, brilliantly, not that I feel that I need to go to a relaxed environment performance for any particular specific reason, but knowing I could nip out to the loo because it was 3 hours meant I didn't have to go out for the loo, weirdly, psychologically. I felt like, oh, I can if I want to, but I don't need to. Rather than sometimes when I'm rushing into a theatre and the bells are ringing and I go, sit down, it's about to start. And you think, oh my God, why is this a prison? It's sort of shout and yelled at. Sometimes the stress of that, just because this is just not a great experience. Why on earth would I want to repeat this? So maybe we're taking a lesson out of Shakespeare back. It's just acknowledging we're humans and we're all just trying to get along here.
You've talked about your production of Julius Caesar a couple of times, and I want to dig into a little bit more. It's been described as being set in a government spin room and as a cross between The Thick of It and The West Wing. And you've hinted a little bit about why this play now, but can we dig into that a little bit more? What led you to choosing this play for this year?
So we've got this team of associates at Lazarus, and we bash around a few titles, and a couple of the actors, a couple of performers in that group, of course, always suggest stuff they want to be in. And so you're like, oh, that's interesting. How does that sit with this, that, and the other? And we're sort of always curating. And I'm a massive fan of seasons. And if we had the resources, and this is something we're working towards, we would go back to seasons where plays speak to each other or casting speaks to each other over the thing. So I'm always thinking kind of like the bigger picture, bigger idea. And then we were thinking, well, what do we do? What's significant in 2024? So we started doing the kind of what the RSC used to do a lot is the anniversaries. And we were looking, well, what's anniversaries coming up? Is something particular? And then I hit across, I think it was just something on social media that says that 2024 is going to be the biggest election year in the world. So the most amount of general elections are going to happen, the biggest ever, basically. The vast majority of the world is going to vote in something this year. And I thought, well, that's interesting because is there something, particularly in the UK at the moment, they've not started the firing pistol on the election, but kind of the political leaders have. They've begun setting out the stall. And it's interesting when you hear people saying, oh, well, politicians are all the same. They're all the same. There's nothing going to change. What's the point in participating? And I find that quite depressing because you sort of go, well, nothing is going to change if you don't participate in it. I suppose that's the Brechtian bit in me again, as in, not just going to put the mirror up to the audience, is also going to give you the hammer to smash it in too, change it, get off your seats and do something about it, folks. So I find that kind of thing depressing. So we were thinking about, well, we were in political plays, what might sort of speak to about politicians and leadership. And of course, you could go to any of the King plays for that, actually. Mm-hmm. And we've got a big project lined up for a year or two that is a big sort of cycle of King plays. We're like, actually, we don't want to go into that territory because we might out-King ourselves. So let's save that for, And Julius Caesar just came up and said, what about Julius Caesar? I said, well, we have done Julius Caesar before, but a long time ago. And maybe there's something in that. So we reread it and had a look at it. And I'd seen a recent production, the RSC's production that went on tour. And it sort of struck me. I've never, ever seen a production that has really made the audience leave feeling sort of empowered about their role in this. What I mean by that is the way they're called plebs. The four people who get to speak in the mob scene and the riot scene and the funeral scene and stuff. The four pleb. Pleb is sort of has a derogatory nature now, doesn't it? I know it didn't then, but we just think, oh, the thick people. Mm-hmm. And when I did a student drama production of it, that was one of the first things these young people said was, oh, God, aren't the people, the public, really thick and stupid? And I thought, oh, that's so depressing that and maybe that's true. Maybe, yes, maybe the public is stupid. Maybe they are thick. And then I thought, God, that's a really depressing theatrical experience. Is you leave a theatre going, well, aren't we all stupid? And I thought, well, is there a way of turning that round where we go, actually, don't we all have the power? And so when I was working on this student version about a year or two ago, I remember saying to some of these young actors, these emerging actors, what stops? So, for example, with Caesar getting going to be crowned off stage, and we hear about it, don't we? With Julius Caesar talking, and then they're disturbed by the shouting off stage, mm-hmm. and they don't know what it is. So they have to ask Casca what's been going on. I said to them, and we did a bit of improv where we sort of did the crowning scene. And I said to them, what stops Caesar just grabbing the crown and going, well, I'm the king, and if you don't like it, I'll chop your heads off? Because that's what some of the other kings in the King's plays do. If you don't like it, I'll just kill you, you execute. What is this thing? Why don't they go all the way? He's offered the crown 3 times. And it's almost like as the crown gets closer to his head, people go, oh, no, we like you, but we don't need to be the king. We don't want a monarch. And so we started asking questions, what is that about? And then I had a quick coffee with a French friend of mine, and I was talking about it. This French friend of mine said, well, you know what it is, don't you? Us French only have to remind our politicians of the guillotine, and we remind them that we've got rid of them before. And I've sort of spat my coffee out. I was like, what? The problem with your British politicians is they're not afraid of you. And at the time when we were having this chat, there was our Prime Minister Boris Johnson. You know, my French friend said he could literally go on TV and slap the Queen around the face, and still people would say, yeah, but, you know, he got all the big calls right, didn't he? Yeah, but he did get the fastest vaccine rollout in the world, didn't he? And it's a bit like what is said in the play. I think it's Casca who talks about, even if Caesar had slapped their mothers, people in the crowd would have still said, oh, isn't he lovely, though? They're Teflon, they're untouchable. And that's dangerous because they start getting a bit Caesar-like, a bit too big for their boots. So essentially going, well, what's interesting then in the play that I've never seen in a production, the one that got closest to it was the Greg Doran production, where he set it in that sort of unnamed African country, which I think you can get on DVD or drama online. I thought it was superb. But in other productions, in most productions, I've not seen the tension between the people and the politicians. So it sort of doesn't make sense. Why don't they just do what they want? So anyway, then we got to this point, we're going, well, how do we empower the people in the audience to go, actually, I have a role in this? And that's where then the concept, in inverted commas, if you like, came in, is what if we demonstrate to the audience in the theatre the relationship, or what our relationship is with these political leaders? And what is it? It's media. So then we started going, well, what if we set it there? It can't be in the House of Commons, because that's where things are announced. That's not where things are decided. So where in government, where is the wrestling? And that's where things like the West Wing came up, or the thick of it. It's often, particularly in the thick of it, it's comedic, but it's also really worrying that it's done in these kind of back offices, paper thrown at people, chaos. That's where that's happening. Maybe we as an audience can go, but how do we as the public get that information? Well, it's through social media, it's through platforms, it's through the mainstream media, the print media. And maybe then, and this is an experiment, by the way, you know, people might watch it, and of course, we'll send you a Zoom link for the stream version so you can watch it. You might go, well, yeah, you haven't achieved that, have you? But theatre is an experiment. So that's sort of the thing at heart, really, is what's the relationship between the politicians and us? And what's that middle ground? And just very briefly, I'd say, I suppose the two versions of that is Brutus sort of feels to me like the auto cue guy who's the mainstream media guy who's talking down the camera. Maybe he's a Sky News, he's a BBC type, I don't know. Mark Antony, though, talks to a different media, and that's directly to the consumer. So that might be social media, that might be that kind of sort of platform, which then has instant results because, of course, at the end of the funeral, there's rioting, and then Cinna, the poet, gets murdered, lynched. So what I'm hoping is that the audience leaves, maybe even before they leave it, they see, hang on a minute, I've got a role to play in this thing called politics, in this thing called democracy. And actually, I hold all the power, because they only get away with what we allow them to get away with. I suppose that there's that old adage, isn't it? You get what you vote for, which is extremely worrying when you look at some of our political figures. So that's the idea, is if it's in this media spin room, we're seeing where the actual deal making, the actual sort of, not literal backstabbing, although, of course, that's what happens, spoiler alert, but the sort of heart of government, I suppose, is the thing that I'd love to sort of lift the lid on. And we've got political consultants coming on board to sort of fact check me about, well, they wouldn't actually do that and this wouldn't happen there. So we're sort of, I know it's not a documentary, but we want to get that right, so it is accurate in its representation. Yeah, so trying to put the power, the thing, the electric line between the politicians and us at the centre of this thing, so that we as an audience go, we have definitely got a role to play in this democracy thing. That's the idea.
Wow. I also know this production is going to feature a first for the Lazarus Theatre Company, that you're going to be combining live theatre and technology. Can you speak a little bit more about your plans for that?
Yes, the perfect example, I suppose, is the funeral scene. So, as I say, Brutus being this sort of bit more mainstream media, the media room becomes a kind of, this is the idea of the production, becomes a little bit like a makeshift TV studio. We're going to perform this on three sides, so a big, long thrust stage. So the idea is we've got to speak to the nation because we're in crisis, because our leader has been assassinated. By the way, I've still got the blood on my hands because I assassinated him. But let's go live to the world. So we're going to do sort of live camera stuff, videos, video wall monitors. There's an idea, don't quote me on this, but we might live stream this every night. At the moment, we're working out the implications of doing that. But I sort of quite like the idea that the actor is not only performing for the audience in the room, but literally live around the world. You could watch this live on our YouTube channel. Anyway, that's maybe a bit crazy. But anyway, thinking about the tech then is in how we use tech, as in then Mark Antony using the idea at the moment is that perhaps in the funeral scene, takes the earpiece out, stops reading the auto cue, and actually we find there's people in the room who put their phones up, and we're talking direct to the consumer, to the person on the other end, so that they think they've got that relationship with Mark Antony. So I suppose it's demonstrating the different routes that we communicate. And there's also a thing that we're working on at the moment is how AI technology then plays a role in that. So how does AI inflate the way that we're communicated to? So for example, we've got a video designer at the moment working on that the characters in the play have social media platforms. And so Mark Antony might give a speech or a bit of a video, and then we see how AI can inflate the views of that or inflates the distribution of that. So actually, as an audience going, why do I keep seeing the same video? Well, because the algorithm's got you. And I love the idea that we cultivate in the audience before the performance, before the production opens, that they're already within that sphere. So, for example, if either of you are tuning into that social media, you'll start seeing things on your feed going, why do I keep seeing this about this? Well, because that might be similar views to Mark Antony. Then there's also a deep fake, but I don't want to spoil that. But there's a moment in the show where there's going to be a deep fake, and it's hopefully going to be so good that the audience doesn't know it's a deep fake until we really reveal it's deep fake. And then we all go, we're all being deep faked. So, trying not to impose too much on Shakespeare's play, but using his play as a skeleton to then address some of the things that are going on. And it's really dangerous, right? If this is what's happening, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest this is happening in our democratic elections, that should really worry us. And it just feels very dangerous and a bit sort of dark, actually. But again, if our audience is sitting there thinking, what's my role in this? Is maybe we just need to be a bit more careful about where we get our information. I don't know what it's like in the States, but there's a lot of mistrust in the mainstream media here. And you can sort of see why. So I suppose that's the question is, where do you get your news from? And do you trust everything that's on your screens? ... Put it back to the audience.
That's very relevant to the States as well. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That's a big undertaking, addressing that.
It really worries me. I mean, we're not going to change this little production in Southwark's not going to sort of change the world, but it might start making us think about things. People aren't reading the chapter of a book to understand the context of an argument. They're just seeing in a tweet a few characters. And context, especially in our industry, is key. Who am I to sort of judge whether it's good or bad? I don't think it's very useful sometimes in a rehearsal room or in a class when we're supposed to be expanding our horizons and broadening our thinking, when someone tries to reduce a whole complex. For example, we're doing a piece from Hamlet, and someone said, well, he's just an idiot. And I thought, well, that's an interesting statement, but to reduce Shakespeare's Hamlet down to a sentence, well, he's just an idiot. Not understanding the word idiot's quite problematic as well, because of the use of the word idiot. And I thought, oh, here's someone who's not trying to be not caring. They're not trying to be awful. It's that the ideas have become so reductive and reduced. Actually, our industry, the thing that we do is trying to expand on that and sort of develop that or broaden our horizons. I thought, oh, these are young artists. These are going to be the next generation of performers. Life isn't as simple as that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure people know this already. It'd be interesting to see it in a practical form. And I really hope that when we go out to the bar afterwards, we're not talking about how actors remember lines, because that's the worst thing I always find when you go out to the bar and they're like, how do you remember all the lines? And I'm like, it's literally their job. It's like, I love it when they're debating the thing that's happened in the play. That's when I know the actors have done a cracking job, because they've made a group of 200, 300 people go and debate something that they've just experienced. And hopefully that will form the debate on this production.
My final question is in some ways about this production. Julius Caesar was Lazarus Theatre Company's first Shakespeare back in 2009. As you've begun pre-production for 2024, what has changed for you or for the company in those 15 years? What have you found as you've been revisiting it that is new this time around for you?
Wow. The whole world has changed. The whole thing's changed. We were young and attractive and naive. And now we're old, not so attractive and possibly still sort of naive, but in a different way. The first thing I suppose to say is that on the 2009 production, I cut Julius Caesar. So the play started with the assassination, which there was an interesting review in the stage newspaper that completely sort of derided and belittled the production. But I sort of had the audacity to just cut the title character in a kind of like, well, great, I can't cast an older actor because we couldn't find a great one. So we're like, why don't we open the show literally with someone being murdered. Let's go. And so we did. So I suppose what I've learned about the play is, oh, actually, you probably do need the title character in it. Well, you don't have to. That's the other thing. It's not on a pedestal. You don't have to. Who writes these rules? You know, like the rules that the title character's got to be in it. Because actually, it's not about Julius Caesar, is it? Actually, the assassinations and the catalyst. You know,
Yeah.
I think it's a story really about society and the way that people behave, carrying out an action without thinking about the consequences. So I suppose there's something about learning about where to tell the story from. I also just think our industry is massively different. You know, in those days we got together. It was sort of this, what's now known as the dreaded profit share, where we basically all just turned up and went, should we just do a play? No one's going to get paid. Yeah, let's do it then. And that was how you made work. You know, coming from a working class council estate, I didn't have the bank of mom and dad to put a show on. So we'd all just rock up under the proviso that if someone gets paid, we all get paid, and we'll all get paid the same. So it was strangely democratic. I'm not advocating for that as a process, by the way, because I'd rather everyone got paid, but there was no money. And so I suppose we've changed as a company because we're a bit more sort of grown up, dare I say. Although I do have to remind ourselves that we should be a bit like Peter Pan. We shouldn't grow up because you get a bit boring. We lose that inquisitiveness and curiosity and playfulness and silliness. You know, in a rehearsal room when you're doing such a serious play, you do need silliness. And in fact, funny, you know, sometimes when we do big sort of hard-hitting plays, tragedies, the rehearsal shots are of people laughing. And we did The Women of Troy, you know, Euripides' play Women of Troy a few years ago. And someone emailed me and said, I thought you were doing a Greek tragedy. And I said, yeah. I went, well, why is all the rehearsal shots you're laughing then? And you sort of realise, well, when you're dealing in such a hard-hitting thing, we laugh so much because that's the sort of medicine to the thing you're dealing with. Whereas sometimes we put rehearsal shots out of comedies and no one's smiling, you know. So I suppose we've grown up as storytellers. The company's grown up. We went through a big moment during the pandemic of change as an organisation. A woman called Kerry Irvine, who's been, I mean, just incredible, really. We had a chat during the first lockdown, about maybe 2 or 3 weeks into the first lockdown in the UK. And I'd spent about 5 minutes talking about all the things we couldn't do. And she just said, oh, just to cut the conversation short, she said, I'm not being rude, but if you're going to talk about all the things you can't do, this is going to go on and on. So why don't we talk about the things you could do? And that was brilliant because she sort of pulled me out of this sort of depressive cycle. She gave me a boot up the as all good friends do, and said, come on, pull yourself together. What can you do? And so we went through an extraordinary amount of organisational change. Before, had done Arts Council applications, but gave up because they're so depressing and hard. Now we're doing them and we touch wood. We've got a fairly successful success rate. So I think we're better producers. We're feeling more artistically successful. The big learning thing for me from the pandemic was the process is now for me way more important than the product. It's actually going, who do I need or who do we need in that room? And that's about choosing your collaborators because the process is going to require that relationship. I suppose the play is different because the world's different. And that's something I love about coming back to a play I've directed before. And when you go back to them, you see new things. And that's part of the wonderful thing about them. But I love that because it keeps you on your toes, keeps you guessing, keeps you playing. I suppose the biggest difference will be it will actually have Julius Caesar in it compared to the last one.
Well, I personally am really excited for you to share the streaming link with us so we can also share it out for anybody who's listened to this episode and is intrigued. So, Ricky, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a delight to talk Shakespeare with you and talk about this show as it is getting off its feet and starting to move towards that rehearsal period. It sounds like a really exciting production. It's been great to get to know Lazarus Theatre Company as well.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great time. I hope I haven't bored too many people with our ramblings, but hopefully people find things insightful. And our stream, a worldwide stream, is October the 17th, if I remember that correctly. But all the details are on our website. At any time you want me to come on as a guest reviewer, like you did with your Tietus about the Julie Taymor, I'd love to do that. But anyway, we should let people go home. Thank you both.
Thank you for listening.
I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
This is Shakespeare, anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare, anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Never Ending Minute by Sounds Like Sander. If you would like to support us, it would help us out if you would hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it.
You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/ShakespeareAnyone.
Patreon patrons get access to exclusive bonus content throughout the year. The link is also in the episode description.
For more, you can visit our website, ShakespeareAnyone.com, follow us on Instagram at ShakespeareAnyonePod, or Twitter at ShakespeareAnyone. For Twitter, that's Shakespeare Any and the number 1. Every other platform is spelled out like the name of the podcast.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here's a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
So this is from Julius Caesar. It's Act 1, Scene 2, and it's said by Cassius to Brutus. And he says, "Men at some time are master of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings."